Happy holidays. This year, Santa is bringing to you the gift of philosophical insight about the profound nature of creation and destruction. So, usually we tend to think of creation and destruction as two opposite things. And we also don't see the relativity of destruction. We tend to think that destruction is just destruction for everybody without realizing that it's actually a matter of perspective. So we're going to bring together some previous concepts from previous episodes that I've talked about. We're going to talk about concepts from the episode Understanding Bias, very profound episode. Go check that out. We're going to be talking about relativity. Check out my episode called Understanding Relativism Part 1. I'm also going to have a Part 2 and a Part 3 in the future, so stick around for that. We're going to be talking about differences of perspective. We're going to be talking about dualities. Check out my 3-part series called Understanding Duality, Part 1, Part 2, Part 3. That's going to play a big role here. So let's really look at this duality of creation versus destruction. A lot of times when I'm speaking about God, or people in general, spiritual people talk about God, we tend to say God is the creator, creator with a capital C. And then if you're trying to be a smart ass, you might say, well, why don't we call God the destroyer? Isn't God also the destroyer? After all, in Hindu religion, there's Shiva, and the Shiva rendition of God is God as the destroyer. And what's more fundamental, creation or destruction? You might wonder. Well, we're going to make sense of all this here. Now, of course, as you should probably already be aware if you're into non-duality, is that this is a duality and that all dualities ultimately collapse. That's a principle I've talked about in the past. So of course, these are all going to collapse into each other. And there's really no difference between creation and destruction. But let's explore this with some examples and really take a look at how this works. So look, humans are very selfish creatures. We're very biased. And our mind tends to have a fixed, rigid, sort of objective standard for what is destruction and what is creation. And we tend to ascribe negative qualities to destruction and positive qualities to creation, but that's a function of how we're defining creation relative to ourselves and destruction relative to ourselves. So we don't see the profound interconnectedness between creation and destruction. So basically the ego mind, because it's so selfish, if something is harming the ego mind, then the ego mind tends to label that thing as destructive and bad or negative. And then if something is helping the ego mind to flourish and to survive, then the ego mind tends to label that thing as constructive or creation. It's promoting the construction, literally the construction of the self or the finite ego. And then we just kind of go about our lives like this and we don't really question it. So let's question this though. So for example, there's this popular notion of, the term weapons of mass destruction. You've heard of this term. Weapons of mass destruction. But let's look at this. So let's say a nuclear weapon would be considered a weapon of mass destruction. So you detonate a nuclear weapon, like during World War II in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and you would think, well, clearly that's a destructive act. You might even say, why would God allow for such a destructive act to occur? The wiping out of these two cities. But notice that to wipe out these two cities, you actually needed to create the nuclear weapon. So the nuclear weapon's creation itself, to have that weapon to detonate, that was a creative act. First of all, notice that. So there's that link between creation and destruction. Every tool that exists that can be used to destroy, whether it's a gun, a bomb, a virus, or whatever else, it had to be created. That's sort of the irony and the paradox here. And there's a deep reason for that, right? In a sense that, if you want to erase something from a piece of paper, you need an eraser, and an eraser is an actual existing thing. And in fact, when you're erasing something, you're erasing some pencil marks on a piece of paper, you are literally erasing the eraser as it is wiping off the graphite or the ink from the paper. And eventually the eraser itself gets erased in the process. Likewise, when you detonate a nuclear weapon, the nuclear weapon itself gets destroyed in the process. Isn't that interesting? But first it had to be created. Of course, the cities that are being destroyed also had to be first created for them to be destroyed. Otherwise, what do you have to destroy? But this is still the superficial layer. There's an even deeper connection between creation and destruction. Notice that actually when you're detonating a nuclear weapon, normally we think of it as destruction, but notice that that's a bias we have because we're looking at it from a sort of a human-centric point of view and a selfish point of view. Actually, the detonation of a nuclear weapon is an act of creation. Notice this. How so? Well, you're creating energy. You're creating heat. You're creating light. You're creating fire. You're creating a mushroom cloud. That's all creation. Even furthermore, we could say that actually you're creating piles of rubble from all the buildings that are destroyed. So really what's happening here is not any objective notion of destruction. You see, I want you to notice the relativity and the subjectivity of what you're calling destruction and creation, because it's not so simple, it's not so obvious. From the universe's point of view, from God's point of view, we might say, the universe can't really tell the difference between creation and destruction because they're literally the same activity. It's us humans who are projecting our own subjective biases and sort of skewing the way we're using these labels, the way we're thinking about what's really going on in the universe. In the universe, what's going on is you have a field of consciousness, that's all that exists, an infinite field of consciousness, and this field of consciousness is imagining and holding different forms. A building, a cat, a tree, a dog, a human, a city, a mushroom cloud, whatever. Think of it like a TV screen. This TV screen can render different forms and images. But the problem is that these images and forms, they conflict with each other. This is the finite nature of finite forms. It has to be this way or that way. It can't be both ways. You either have a cat or a dog, but you can't have a cat and a dog in the same place at the same time. Otherwise, you don't have a cat or a dog, you have something else. Maybe a hybrid between the two, but that's not the same thing as a cat and a dog. So really what I want you to start to think of creation and destruction more as a process of transformation. That's how you sort of unify the two into a single force. What's really happening is that consciousness is transforming itself all the time. See my episode called Understanding Impermanence. That's one of the principles of Buddhism that you should study and contemplate and start to notice all around you, right? Consciousness is constantly fluid and it's impermanent. It's changing forms. It's shape-shifting. Remember in my episode about Aztec non-duality, called Aztec non-duality, I talk about Teotl, or God, as being an infinite shapeshifter. So that's really what God as creator is. It's a shapeshifter. But for it to shift shapes, it has to let go of old shapes and adopt new shapes. And that's the process of life and death, or creation and destruction. So even when you detonate that nuclear weapon and you destroy a whole city, you are actually creating. That's a creative act. You're creating rubble, you're creating death, you're creating blood, you're creating guts, you're creating radiation, you're creating disease and sickness, and these are all, in a sense, things that need to be created. Now, of course, from the human point of view, this might seem nasty, ugly, brutish, evil, whatever, but these are just our subjective judgments. After all, who's to say what is creation, what is destruction? You might go even a level further and you might say that actually the detonation of those nuclear weapons created peace where before there was war. So the destruction of those cities led to a new level of stability and peace in the world, ending World War II. Now, you can argue about whether it was necessary, whether it was an excessive use of force. Of course, you can argue all those things. I'm not interested in debating that here. You can make a good case that you didn't need to drop these nuclear weapons on Japan, and you could still have created peace by other means. Sure, okay, fine. Those are just little matters of minutia. But I just want you to see that a lot of the violence that happens in the world is actually part of a larger creative process. I want you to start to see that, because otherwise it's difficult for your mind to make sense of violence, war, genocide, other sorts of quote unquote evil and selfish acts that happen all the time in the news and throughout human history. For example, you might think that, and by the way, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying this to justify any kind of activity. So what I'm saying here is completely neutral in terms of like morals or normativity, in terms of like what you should do. I'm not making any prescriptions. I'm not making any rationalizations for why something was good or bad. That's a complete misunderstanding of what I'm saying here. So I'm not saying that the dropping of these nuclear weapons was a good thing or a bad thing. We're not interested in that here. This is a discussion about the deeper metaphysics of what we actually mean by creation, destruction, right? So I'm going to be giving some more disturbing and radical examples here that might be a little distasteful and offensive, and I don't want you to get the idea that I'm somehow trying to justify this activity. I'm not. I'm just trying to get you to question and to see things from different perspectives. So for example, notice that, like, you might say, well, the Holocaust was a purely destructive act. It wasn't an act of creation. But is that actually true? Take a look at what the Holocaust was in an objective sense, not from your human biases. See, you might say, well, on the surface of it, it looks like, you're killing millions of Jews in gas chambers. That seems like a very destructive act. What are you creating there? Nothing is being created. Nothing positive is being created in that process. It's just shameless destruction. But look at it from the point of view of the people who initiated the Holocaust, let's say Hitler and his henchmen. What were they trying to do? Were they doing it purely from a destructive point of view? No. To them, it was actually a means towards a creative end. What was their creative end? What was their creative vision? Their creative vision was to create like a pure Germanic, race, to cleanse their society of what they perceived to be parasites and of what they perceived to be impurities and evil. So in their minds, and I'm not saying this is right or wrong, I'm just saying in their minds, the way they framed it is that the Holocaust was a means of creating that ideal society that they wanted, as twisted as that might seem to us today. You see, so for them, it was actually a creative act. And so what I'm trying to just show you with these examples is that the line between what is creation and destruction is very relativistic and very subjective, and it's not so clear. For example, let's take a look at the American Revolution, the founding of America as a country. Now, if you're American and you're like an American patriot, you tend to see the Revolutionary War as an act of creation. America was literally forged in the waging of the war, with George Washington and the founding fathers, rising up against the Britain and against the king and the monarchy and all this, and constructing a constitution. Very, very creative. But that's how Americans frame it from the American point of view, which is biased. Like if you look at it from the British point of view, the creation of America was the destruction or the loss of a British colony. So which one was it? Was it an act of creation or an act of destruction? Is the glass half full or is the glass half empty? And what's the difference? You might even say that, in a certain sense, the creation of America was the ultimate destruction of the British Empire. It was like one of the first dominoes that fell in the British Empire, which over the next 100 years or so collapsed one domino at a time. How about 9/11? You might say, well, obviously 9/11 is an act of destruction. That's from the American point of view. But from the point of view of the people who were perpetrating 9/11, bin Laden, let's say, and his henchmen and allies, for them, it was an act of creation in the sense that in their minds, they were initiating an attack on an aggressor that was subjugating them in their own home countries in the Middle East and not allowing them to create the kind of countries and the kind of organizations and governments that they felt they were entitled to in their own countries. You know, they wanted an Islamic state that was very theocratic and religious and very medieval in a certain sense. And America was destroying that. And by attacking America, you were creating space to be able to create that kind of thing for yourself in the Middle East. Now, whether that actually panned out or not, you know, it's a matter of debate. But that's how it was framed in their mind. Furthermore, notice that the destruction, the actual physical destruction of the World Trade Center, that led to the creation of piles of rubble and debris, of smoke, of fire. Now you might say, well, Leo, but these things are worthless. They're not as important as the buildings that were there. But again, do you notice that that's your bias? The universe doesn't share that bias. To the universe, the difference between the World Trade Center standing in its full glory versus laying there as a pile of rubble and, you know, twisted concrete and a fireball and cloud and smoke of debris, like it, from the universe's point of view, one is not more preferable than the other. See? And which one is more preferable to you depends on your point of view. If your office is in that building, then you very much don't want it to be a pile of rubble. On the other hand, if you perceive that the people in that building are doing something wrong, then for you, maybe it's a good idea that the building was destroyed. You see? And so this explains a lot of the violence that happens in the world. A lot of the violence that happens in the world is actually people who are trying to do something creative, but they need to destroy something to create space for the creative thing that they want to create. Because a lot of times there's an obstacle and there's a trade-off between having one thing existing versus another thing existing. Furthermore, notice that the destruction of the World Trade Center led to the creation, the space was opened up for creating the new building, the Freedom Tower, I think it's called, whatever it's called now. There's a new building in that spot. That new building couldn't exist there unless the old building was destroyed. Now, I'm not saying it was good or bad that the old building was destroyed. I'm just saying that it's just like a physical or even a metaphysical fact that you had to destroy the first building to create the second one because you couldn't create them both at the same place at the same time. So really, if you want to integrate creation destruction, you can kind of zoom out and see it in a bigger picture context. You can see that really what happens is a transformation occurred. Reality is a never-ending process of transformation, self-transformation. So the World Trade Center that used to be there was transformed into the Freedom Tower that's standing there now. And then in 100 years, that Freedom Tower may be demolished and turned into some new third building. And so this is going to keep happening. And this is how reality works. So everything is transformation. The problem is that our minds, because we ourselves are forms, we're attached to being finite forms within this constantly churning, ever transforming field of consciousness that we have a bias of our own to maintain our form. And so because of this, we tend to label those things that threaten the perpetuation of our forms as being negative, destructive, or evil. But actually, notice that with the death of your body, it's not just that your body is going to be destroyed, it's really that your body is going to be transformed. Your human physical body is going to rot and decay. Let's say if you get buried underground, it'll rot and decay, which will lead to the creation of maggots and worms and flies and bacteria, viruses, and plants and grass and trees. The roots of the trees under which you're buried will suck up your nutrients and will use the nutrients from your body to literally grow and blossom flowers and bear fruits, which then birds will eat those fruits. Or, a hummingbird will come by and suck the nectars from that flower that has blossomed from your corpse. And then literally the atoms and energy in your body and corpse will feed that hummingbird through the nectar. And then that hummingbird will lay an egg. And then from that egg will hatch a new hummingbird. And then that hummingbird will be eaten by some other bird when it dies. And so the cycle of life will just continue. And all of that will literally be the transformation of your body into all these other forms. You see, but you don't care about any of that because you're selfish. All you care about is just preserving your body. You don't care about how by preserving your body, look what you're doing. You're denying the nutrients to the trees. You're denying food to worms and to maggots and flies. And you're denying the birth of new hummingbirds. See? So it's a very selfish act of you just staying alive and preserving your form. Because while you're preserving your form, you're literally taking up some portion of the atoms and molecules and energy in the universe. You're locking that energy into this particular shape, which denies it the opportunity of turning into some other form or shape. So because you exist as a human, and because mankind exists as 8 billion humans on this planet, there are, as a result of that energy and matter cannot be utilized to create more kangaroos, more hummingbirds, more trees, more rats, more flies, and whatever else might be possible with all that matter and energy. You see? So who's to say what's really good and what's really bad here? I want you to notice how subjective your idea of good and bad are. When you're clinging to some form, if you are that form, or if that form helps you to survive as the form that you identify yourself to be, notice you're going to have a bias towards wanting to maintain that. You're going to rationalize in all sorts of ways. For example, if you're working for a corporation, let's say you're working for a military defense contractor like Lockheed Martin, and you are manufacturing missiles that are used in the Middle East to bomb whatever, either civilians or terrorists, whatever, probably a combination of both. You see, because for your body to survive and for the bodies of your children to survive and to maintain their form, you have to go to work to Lockheed Martin, and you have to be creative to create missiles for them, let's say, as an engineer. So you create these missiles. These missiles are, of course, created weapons of destruction that will destroy stuff, but the stuff you're destroying there, it's helping you to feed your children and to feed yourself and to maintain your family. And so therefore now you're attached to maintaining the form of Lockheed Martin. Because if Lockheed Martin as a corporation loses its shape and form, and devolves or dissolves, goes bankrupt or whatever, then you're going to lose your livelihood. You can't now be creating missiles anymore. And now your family's going to starve. And perhaps your children will die because you can't get the medical care or whatever. in the most extreme example, right? So you're very much attached to creating missiles. You're very much attached to voting in a certain way that helps you to maintain Lockheed Martin as a company, to get your contracts, subsidies. Maybe war is helpful for your company to flourish. Maybe if the war in the Middle East ends, then you're going to lose your job because they don't need to manufacture so many new missiles anymore, and they don't need your services anymore. And then how are you going to feed your children? You see? So when you're this person, when this person is working at Lockheed Martin, is that person being creative or destructive? Again, the glass is simultaneously half full and half empty. Of course, the person is being creative when he's engineering these missiles. But at the same time, these missiles are being used to create destruction in the world. But furthermore, there's an additional layer, is that the destruction that's created in the Middle East, you could argue that destruction in the Middle East helps to create the American empire, right? So you're not just fighting for the defense of Lockheed Martin, you're also fighting for the larger collective of the American empire, which also serves you as a citizen, as part of the American empire. It helps you because it lowers gas prices for you. It lowers the costs of goods and services, of food and other things like that. It gives you more military power, more geopolitical power around the world. This is why American empire is maintained through military force. And so you're a beneficiary of that. And hey, so am I as an American citizen. We're beneficiaries of that. But at what cost, right? See, we have to destroy in order to create. Think about it very primitively from the point of view of predator-prey relationships in nature. You have a wolf and a rabbit. From the wolf's point of view, hunting rabbits is a creative activity because he's creating a meal for himself when he hunts the rabbit. And then that allows him to procreate and to feed his wolf pups. And that's creative from the wolf's point of view. But from the rabbit's point of view, it's very destructive. So which is it? Is it creation or destruction? Because you see, if the wolf doesn't destroy the rabbit, then the wolf will destroy itself. It'll go hungry. Its pups will go hungry, and they will end up destroyed. And from the rabbit's point of view, it's sort of the inverse of that. By running away from the wolf successfully, the rabbit is doing a creative act because this helps the rabbit to then procreate and to be creative. But then that hurts the wolf. And look at what's happening when the wolf eats the rabbit. The wolf is actually transforming that rabbit energy into wolf energy. And if the rabbit runs away from the wolf is going to die from hunger. That wolf's corpse is going to lay on the ground. It's going to feed the grass and the trees and the plants, and the rabbit is going to feast off of the grass that is fertilized by the wolf's corpse. So the rabbit, by running away from the wolf, is actually transforming, in a more indirect way, is transforming wolf energy into rabbit energy. It's not a perfect transformation. There's also going to be grass energy and tree energy and fly energy, maggot energy, worm energy, all sorts of other things are going to be the wolf is going to transform into. But you see, it's very profound how all this works when you look at it from a sort of objective, non-biased point of view, isn't it? Very interesting. So creation, destruction is a duality, which is really just two sides of the same coin. And you can't have a coin with just one side. This is the nature of reality. So it's important to see how relativistic this is, how subjective this is, because this puts various kinds of things into proper context. You start to see reality more from God's point of view. And then you can start to remove the judgment and the evil from reality. because you no longer see particular acts as being evil because you're not looking at it from a selfish lens anymore. You're seeing it in a fuller, more absolute context, which integrates creation and destruction. Really fundamentally, what I want you to see is that the creation of anything requires destruction at exactly the same place and time. So the best way to see this is just imagine a blank piece of paper or canvas. No matter what shape I decide to draw on this canvas, let's say I just decide to just draw a circle. It's like a solid circle, solid sphere. So I'm drawing that. As I'm taking my paintbrush and I'm drawing that solid sphere and filling it in, I am simultaneously, let's say I'm filling it in with a color like blue, I'm simultaneously destroying the white canvas that was there. You see how that works? And it's like this with anything that's being created. There's always a trade-off. When you're creating something, you're destroying, at the very minimum, you're destroying the emptiness that was there. You're also destroying the potential for something else to be there. So when I'm drawing this thing solid blue, I'm destroying the possibility of it being red or yellow or any other color or any other shape. See that? This is a very fundamental aspect of all finite forms. What do I mean by a finite form? A finite form means it's definite and specific in some way. So for example, a red circle is a finite form. A blue triangle is a finite form. A black square is a finite form. Why is it finite? Well, because it has a specific shape and color and characteristics to it, which is not the totality of everything it could possibly be. It's just a small subset of what it could be, right? And so because it's just one possibility out of many possibilities, that it's finite. And the nature of every finite thing is that it occupies space and time and certain dimensions and characteristics it has, which are precisely not some of its opposite characteristics. If I draw a small circle, then it's not a large circle. If I draw a square, then it's not a circle. If I draw a green triangle, then it's not a red triangle. If I draw a cat, then I'm not drawing a dog, and so on. And so this trade-off exists with every finite form. And so, does it matter whether we call God creator or destroyer? Well, both are happening at the same time in a certain sense. But if we take the duality between lowercase c creation and lowercase d destruction, and we sort of unify that duality as I've done and explained in my series, my three-part series, Understanding Duality, Part 1, 2, 3, what we have is we can unify the two together, transcend them into a higher absolute. And that absolute would be creation with a capital C. So creation with a capital C includes both lowercase c creation and destruction together. And it unifies them together. Because truly what you become conscious of when you become conscious of the absolute is you become conscious that the only thing that exists in reality is an infinite field of consciousness. This is it right here. You're experiencing this infinite field of consciousness right now. This field of consciousness itself cannot be destroyed. It can't not exist because existence is an absolute. So consciousness is absolutely existing. That can't be changed. But what can change is that consciousness can take different forms. It can take different shapes, or it can just be empty. But when it's empty, it's like a blank canvas. It still exists. It exists as emptiness. And so you might say, well, isn't that destruction? If we just eliminate all the shapes and all the colors and all the sounds and all the phenomena, then it seems like we've destroyed the universe. You haven't really destroyed it. You've just made it empty. It's just a blank canvas. It still exists as a blank canvas. See? Now you might wonder, well, can't I also destroy the blank canvas itself too? And here's where it gets tricky. No, you can't, because when it comes to, like, if we're talking about a painting, the canvas that the painting is painted on is still a thing, it's still a shape or a form, and that, of course, you can destroy. Like if you're thinking of a white blank piece of paper, you can destroy that whiteness. That whiteness is not emptiness. Or even if you think about the vacuum of outer space, you might say, well, that's emptiness. It's just pitch black emptiness. Actually, that's not emptiness. The emptiness that I'm talking about is so empty that it's absolutely empty. It's so empty that you couldn't empty it anymore. There's nothing there for you to destroy. You see? This absolute emptiness, you can't get underneath that. You can't destroy that. It just is emptiness. So what do you do with this? What do you do with this knowledge? Well, admittedly, it's a bit abstract here and philosophical, and you probably don't have an immediate idea of how to apply this in your life to make a bunch of money or whatever. That's not the point, though. The point is to start to see reality see the structure of reality for how it actually is, how it works, and to appreciate just the structure. Just the appreciation of the structure changes your relationship to reality, makes you appreciate reality more. It's not about using this knowledge to do something with it, although you could find ways to use it, but that's not the point. The point is just to start to see reality clearly for what it is, and also to distance yourself from your own biases and from your own selfishness and from your own limited perspectival ways, relativistic ways of, seeing events in the world. So when you see a mass shooting on television, ordinarily you think of it as just like, oh, it's just a shameless act of destruction. But this is a mistake. And if you start to see reality in this way, especially when you're watching the news, you see a lot of destructive stuff in the news, you're not putting into the proper context, and you're not seeing how it's part of a larger process of creation. And so in this way, you actually get disconnected from the larger absolute flow of creation that is constantly ongoing in the world. Whether you're watching the news or you see a car wreck on the side of the road, it's all an act of creation. It's all an act of creation with a capital C. It's all an act of transformation. And so it's important to detach yourself from needing creation to be in some specific finite way that suits you. Detach yourself and appreciate just the larger absolute flow of creation. Take yourself out of the picture and just appreciate the beauty of creation. Appreciate its brutality. There are brutal aspects to creation. Sometimes you're going to lose things that you really were attached to and that you really wish would have stuck around for longer, whether it's your loved ones, your pets, your family, your friends, your spouse, your children, or even material objects like your car, your fancy car that you just bought or whatever else, or your own body. It's all going to deteriorate, and it's all going to be impermanent. It's all going to change and shape shift. And so ultimately, the whole goal of spirituality is to detach yourself so much from this ever-flowing, shape-shifting process of creation such that you disidentify with any particular way creation ought to be, ought to unfold, or what shape it ought to take, and to just enjoy whatever shapes it takes, and to trust that whatever process it's going through, that is the highest good. And to just trust that and to be at peace with that and to surrender to that, rather than trying to hold on and micromanage the whole process and needing to have it flow in whichever way you need it, whichever way I need it. Because that's a losing game. You're always going to lose that game, and it's going to create a lot of suffering and frustration for you. Whereas if you are more wise, you're going to realize that your ego can't control this. This process of creation is way too immense. It's way too profound. It's way too intelligent to be subject to the whims of your particular selfish needs and desires. And so the only proper answer to this is to surrender your own needs and desires, to step aside and to see that there's something much more profound and larger at work here that is way just beyond you and your personal human needs. And the more you do that, the more detached you become. This is what spiritual detachment is about. Then the more happy you can be, independent of what's happening in the world. And then even all that destructive, evil, violent stuff that is happening, you see it in a proper context. And it doesn't bug you as much, and you're not judging it as much as normal people do, and therefore it's not triggering you as much. Therefore, you can maintain your peace and your happiness more than ordinary people do. See how this works? So it's a little bit abstract, but at the same time, really where it gets practical is in terms of how you relate to the activities and events of the world. You can either get triggered and butthurt by them, or you can see them as something of a larger game that's being played, and you can start to see the beauty even in the quote-unquote ugly and evil aspects of reality, which means that you're integrating them, which means that now this is in a certain sense an aspect of shadow work. You're basically integrating your shadow, and you're expanding your sense of self to include all of the richness and complexity of the shape-shifting of reality. And you're adopting the entire flow of reality as your own identity, as what you are. And that is you moving closer towards the perspective of God. The more you do that, the more godlike you become. Until eventually you realize that you are the creator of this entire flow. God is an infinite process of self-creation. It's a dream that keeps creating itself over and over and over again, that never ends. And so your job, spiritually speaking, is to fall in love with yourself and this dreaming process. Fall in love with it more and more and more, accept it more and more and more and more, rather than trying to limit it or constrain it or cling to it. It's the clinging and the constraining of it which is really the problem. And so the wisest of us let go of that, and that's difficult to do. It's very difficult to do in certain situations. But you try to, you work on it, you let go more and more and more, until eventually you just fall in love with the entire process itself, very holistically. You look at it very holistically, and you fall in love with the entire process. And this is the equivalent of falling in love with yourself, or the equivalent of discovering that God is love, or the equivalent of discovering infinite love, the equivalent of discovering yourself as love. which is really the whole point of life and of reality, is to discover deeper and deeper aspects of consciousness as love. But of course, that requires you surrendering all of the finite aspects of yourself and all your attachments and all the stuff that you cling to. And it's also scary. It takes courage. It takes fearlessness to do this, and it takes selflessness to do this. And so this is a lifelong process that you commit to and work on every single day.